Well, greetings to everybody. I am just delighted to be addressing the Seek 21 conference, even if it has to be in this virtual way. You know, I've said this before many times publicly, but I'll say it again. I think Focus is one of the great ministries of its kind anywhere in the world. So I believe in what you're doing. Delighted to be able to be a participant in your conference this year. And furthermore, I was delighted when I got news of what you wanted me to speak about. So the committee proposed a topic, and for me it was the identity of Jesus. There's nothing I'd rather talk to you about than Jesus. He's everything. He's the Alpha and the Omega. He's the name above every other name. He's the standing or falling point of our faith. Everything centers upon him, revolves around him. What's the most fundamental claim the church makes about Jesus? It's this, everybody, that in the singularity of his person, he is the coming together of divinity and humanity. Two natures, divine and human, coming together in the unity of his person without mixing, mingling, or confusion. As such, and I want to stress this right away, that can sound kind of desperately abstract, but as such, Jesus is the fulfillment and culmination of all the great institutions of Israel. Think of temple, think of prophecy, think of Torah, think of law, covenant. All of it was designed to bring divinity and humanity together, to reconcile God and his people. All this happens in the most unsurpassable way in the very person of Jesus, where the two natures, divine and human, come together. That's why we say he's the fulfillment of Israel. That's why we can say with Paul, he's the yes to all the promises made to Israel. Furthermore, it's why we say he is our salvation. If Jesus is simply divine and not human, then we're not saved. If Jesus is human simply and not divine, then we're not saved. That's the way St. Athanasius put it long ago. Our salvation depends upon the coming together of divinity and humanity. Think for a second, it's a very common view today that Jesus is a great ethical and moral teacher. Okay, if that's all he is, then he's in the same boat we are. If he's not divine, he needs to be saved as much as we do. But turn that around. As the church fathers said, what has not been assumed has not been saved. If he's not fully human, then we have not been saved. The great orthodox teaching of the church is meant finally to preserve the dynamics of salvation, because that is what happens when divinity and humanity come together. Now, up and down the centuries, you know this. Heretics have emphasized in a one-sided way divinity or humanity. Think of the Monophysites, the Docetists, centuries ago, who overemphasized the divinity of the Lord. But think, too, of the Nestorians who overemphasized his humanity. I'd say today we're much more Nestorian than we are Monophysite. We tend to overemphasize the humanity of the Lord. The trouble with all these heretical positions is they undermine the fact of salvation. So, for us today and for you in your missionary work, you're going to come up against this problem of, simply humanizing Jesus, making him one interesting religious figure among many. We need, I think, especially today, to emphasize his divinity. Now, why do we say it? What's the warrant for claiming the divinity of Jesus? I would say this. Though he is like Abraham and Moses and Jacob and Jeremiah and Isaiah, sent, so all those figures would have said they were sent by the God of Israel. And Jesus, too, says, I'm sent. Nevertheless, Jesus speaks and acts in the very person of the God of Israel, which makes him qualitatively different than any of the other sent figures who came before him. Jesus is presented consistently in all the Gospels as the one speaking and acting in the very person of God. Now, let me try to show this with just a few examples. But see, once you get this, everybody, you see it everywhere. You see it, in fact, as the primary purpose of the Gospels. The Gospels are not there to say, oh, look at what a wonderful ethical teacher he is. The Gospels are there to say, this is the one who is God. A few examples. Jesus says to the paralyzed man, my son, your sins are forgiven. And the bystanders remark, why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone? It's Mark 2, 4-7. You know, when I was coming of age, we were taught largely that the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are a low Christology, emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. And only in John do you find this very high Christology emphasizing his divinity. Can I just say to everybody, that's so much nonsense. That statement here, now it's using a more of a Jewish symbol system and context, but that statement from Mark 2 is just as high a Christology as anything in the Gospel of John. How about this? Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, so in Matthew 5, 6, 7, Jesus says, you've heard it said, but I say. Now, we might just, pass over that little statement. Trust me, in the first century, in a Jewish context, they didn't pass it over because what he was referring to there was the Torah. You've heard it said in the highest possible authority there is, the Torah that was given to Moses. But I say, that took their breath away because he was now claiming the authority of the one who spoke to Moses. How about this? In reference to himself, Jesus says, you have a greater than the temple here. That's Matthew 12, 6. Jacob Neusner, the great American Jewish theologian, wrote a book about Jesus. Pope Benedict liked it a lot. And he said, if I were following Jesus and listening to his teaching, I would have liked a lot of what he said. I would have followed him. Until he said that. Neusner said, then I would have walked. Now, you see why? For a first century Jew, a temple, the dwelling place of God in practically a literal sense. The temple, the holiest possible place because Yahweh, the God of Israel, lives there. Therefore, for Jesus to say in reference to himself, you have a greater than the temple here, that means he's the dwelling place of God. And they didn't miss that. That's why it was such a strange, breathtaking thing for him to say. How about this? Referencing his own teaching, Jesus remarks, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall never pass away. It's Matthew 24, 35. I've written a few things in my life. If I were to stand up before you and hold up one of my books or articles, and if I were to say, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. You'd have me institutionalized. You'd call somebody to help this poor, deluded man. Who could say such a thing about his own words except the one who is himself in person the eternal word? And this, unless you love me more than your mother and father, more than your very life, you are not worthy of me. It's Matthew 10, 37. Now, again, we could imagine maybe a religious teacher or founder saying, unless you love God more than your very life, unless you love God more than your mother and father, the things you love most in the world, you're not worthy. But to say it of yourself, unless you love me more than the highest goods in this world, more than your very life, you're not worthy of me. The only one who could legitimately say that is the one who is in his own person the highest good. That story of the calming of the storm at sea, which you can find in all four Gospels. Great nature miracle. Yeah, of course it was. But no first century Jewish audience would have missed the overtones of that. Jesus who calms the storm. Throughout the Old Testament, we find references to God's power, Yahweh's power to still the storm. Just one of many is Psalm 107. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. I love in John's version, Jesus walks on the water. Again, they wouldn't have missed the reference to the very beginning of the book of Genesis, when the Ruach Yahweh, the breath, the Spirit of God, hovers over the surface of the Tohu Vabohu, the stormy, chaotic waters. Who is this man that even the wind and sea obey him? Do you see the implication very clearly for this Jewish audience is this is the one who in his own person is doing what God alone can do. And so, everybody, in light of all of this, we can understand the famously weird question that Jesus poses in Caesarea Philippi. Who do the crowds, who do people say that I am? You know, again, if I were to say, I spoke to the Seek 21 conference, I mean, what did they think about my talk? Or, what do people think about some of the books I've written? Or what are people saying about... Those would be reasonable questions. But if I were to pose the question to all of you, who do people say that I am? Well, you'd think I'd lost my mind. And we hear this all the time in the Gospels, but how peculiar that question is. But it makes the point that the Gospels are not first and foremost interested in the moral teaching of Jesus. They're interested in who he is. Notice, please, everybody, the creeds that we proclaim every Sunday don't say a word about his teaching, but they are obsessed with the fact that he's God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. That's not some later Greek imposition. Don't believe people that say that. That's an instinct coming right up out of the Gospels themselves. They want us to know who this Jesus is. And now here's the point. This means that Jesus compels a choice, a decision, in a way that no other religious founder or figure does. And now, very important for all of you who are involved in missionary work. And I don't mean that you do this in some kind of violent way or imposing yourself. But it is implicit in the theologic of the Gospels that Jesus compels a choice. If he is who he says he is, well, I have to give my whole life to him, right? If he is God, not just one teacher among many, he's God. Well, then my mind, my soul, my heart, my body, everything must belong to him. He's my everything. He is indeed the Alpha and the Omega. And this is what C.S. Lewis saw, of course, so clearly. If he's not who he says he is, then he's not a good person. He's not an inspiring ethical teacher. He's a bad man. He's deluded. He's crazy. He's self-absorbed. Hence the famous C.S. Lewis trilemma. Either he's liar, lunatic, or Lord. The point is, you got to make a decision. The Gospels compel it. And doesn't Jesus himself say it? You're either with me or you're against me. Now again, everybody, I'm not proposing you do this in some aggressive way, but it is indeed implicit in the logic of the Gospels that Jesus compels a choice. Let me plant this in your minds. If you proclaim Christ and people remain indifferent about him, you haven't proclaimed him adequately. Give me, in fact, any day someone who is against Jesus after I proclaimed him, at least I've proclaimed what's decisively important about him. If they say, yeah, this guy who's claiming to be God, look, and I'm against that, at least I've adequately presented who Jesus is. He does compel a choice. Now, I've been focusing on the divinity of the Lord because, as I say, in our time, that's what's often overlooked. But I want to say just a few things in the last couple minutes about the humanity of Jesus, because it's the coming together. If you hyper-stress the divinity, you're going to have all kinds of problems. That's the Monophysite problem, that he's only one nature, right? Monophysis. That he's divine and human. Go back for a second to the Council of Chalcedon, 451, that says the two natures in Jesus come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion. How important that is. In other words, God's coming close does not result in the suppression or eradication of Jesus' humanity. but rather in the enhancement and elevation of it. Look at all the old myths. When the gods come close, the gods break into our world, people are incinerated, people are overwhelmed, people have to give way because the gods exist in a competitive manner. For them to appear, we have to cede. But look at the claim now of Christianity, that God in Christ comes close, but does not overwhelm the humanity to which he comes close. The logic that obtains here is the logic of the burning bush. The bush is on fire, but not consumed. Now there's the opposite of the mythological imagination. No, as God comes close to a creature, the creature's beauty and integrity is enhanced, not overwhelmed. And so we say Jesus is true God and true man. I love how we can have Thomas the Apostle saying, "My Lord and my God," to Jesus, and Pontius Pilate saying, "Ecce homo," behold the man. Both are true. In the measure that he's divine, he is fully human. And now see what lies behind that, everybody, or lies, rather I should say, as an implication of that, is that Christianity is the greatest humanism ever proposed. There is no philosophy, ancient or modern, that proposes a greater humanism than Christianity. Because we proclaim the divinization of our humanity, that in Christ, as the Greek fathers put it, we find theosis. As the Latin fathers put it, divinizatio, divinization. Our humanity is raised up, enhanced, rendered more beautiful and radiant by the presence of God. And so as you go forth, I know today, believe me, I know, we're up against a cultural view that often sees religion as oppressive, that it denies our humanity. Don't you believe it. Go forth with this incarnational confidence that it's when you proclaim the divinity of Jesus, that you are also by the same token proclaiming the greatest possible humanism. That's that marvelous paradox at the heart of our incarnational faith. Don't be ashamed of Jesus, everybody. Proclaim Jesus divine and human with confidence, with joy, with panache. And you'll find your missionary vocation fulfilled. Great talking to you today, and God bless you, everybody. Could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. There are two terms I want to talk about that I think are both extremely dysfunctional and get us nowhere, but boy, are they popular in the commentariat. The first one is culture warrior, and the second one is divisive. Now, culture warrior, I think, is especially a stupid and unilluminating term, and here's why. It's used almost exclusively by people on the left to excoriate people on the right. So if you're on the right and you're opposed to abortion on demand, you're opposed to gay marriage, you're in support of religious liberty, that sort of thing, well, then you're excoriated as a culture warrior. You're a rock'em sock'em over and against kind of person. Well, I always smile when I read that because, I mean, the left, are you kidding? The left is just as much a culture warrior as the right. I mean, the left stands in favor of certain things in the culture, but the left is, gosh, radically against racism, against xenophobia, against homophobia, against environmental pollution. The left stands in a warlike attitude against all sorts of things in the culture. My point here is it's a term that gets us nowhere. It doesn't advance the argument in any way. It's simply a way of branding your opponent as a bad guy and signaling, I guess, your own virtue that, oh, you stand above the fray. You're not a warrior. You're a person of peace. I mean, give me a break. Everybody, no matter what position you take, you're against something in the culture. And I think you're two heroes of the left, heroes of mine, too. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day. I mean, culture warrior, you bet they were. Now, both of them advocated nonviolent ways of engaging the culture, but King stood as a mighty warrior against racism, against segregation, against the degradation of his own people and of minorities, and did so in a very confrontational way, nonviolently, but in a very confrontational way. Same with Dorothy Day. Talk about a hero of nonviolence, to be sure, but boy, did she take on racism and militarism and the violence of our culture. My point is, they're as much culture warriors as anybody on the right. And so again, my point is, the use of that term gets us nowhere. It applies just as much to the one who's using it pejoratively as anybody else. And so the desideratum here is not to stay at that level of essentially name-calling. We haven't gone much beyond the sixth grade playground when we're using terms like culture warrior to excoriate our opponents. Far, far better would be a return to real argument. Why don't we talk about these particular issues? So what about abortion? What about militarism? What about violence in our culture? What about, now take your pick, whether it's excoriated by left or right, let's talk about the issue and not stay at the level of essentially name-calling. And that leads me to the second term, which I think is also comically ineffectual, let's say, in the public conversation. And that term is divisive. So invariably, people will say of their opponents, oh, he's being divisive. How divisive of you? Well, look, there is a morally bad form of divisiveness. If it's born of hatred, if it's born of a desire to harm somebody, I've said many times that one of the devil's names, diabolos, means the scatterer. I mean, so if you really are in that attitude of hatred and violence trying to divide people, that's always a bad thing, quite right. But here's my point. Anytime you make a real argument, anytime you make a real intellectual judgment, you are ipso facto divisive. And I'll show that now with the help of Bernard Lonergan, the great Jesuit philosopher. So Lonergan said, the four great imperatives that should animate anyone seeking truth. First of all is to be attentive. So see what's going on. What are the data? Be attentive. Secondly, be intelligent, by which he meant form hypotheses, have bright ideas, come up with all kinds of interesting possible explanations for a given set of data. So think of a scientist, hypothesizing. Think of a philosopher looking at different patterns of meaning. Okay. But, says Lonergan, the third step in the process, beyond be intelligent, is be reasonable. And to be reasonable is to make a judgment, is to say, okay, of all these bright ideas, they're all interesting and intriguing, but there's one that's the right idea. And there's one that's at least the relatively adequate explanation. So a scientist will do experiments to determine which of his bright hypotheses is in fact the right hypothesis. So a philosopher, having looked at a variety of patterns, will say, but I think that's the best way to explain a phenomenon. Here's the point. Anytime you make that move, you decide. And the word decide is from a Latin root, close to scissors, by the way, that means to cut. To cut. When you say, yeah, that's the right answer, you have necessarily cut off all the other hypotheses. You've said, I think those are inadequate. You've decided, you've made a judgment. And therefore, everybody, ipso facto, you have become divisive, because people who hold the other hypotheses are going to feel, well, I guess he doesn't like me. I guess he's decided against me. Well, yeah, at least he's decided against your proposal. Anytime you make a judgment, which is an advance in the direction of the truth, you are divisive. And now Lonergan's fourth imperative is to be responsible. That means to accept the implications of the judgment you've made. If you say, yeah, this is the right decision, this is the right hypothesis, this is the right pattern of meaning, well, now accept that. Live up to it. And one way you live up to it, Lonergan thought, was to put up with people who are now going to start criticizing you. So if the minute you make a judgment and then you get criticism, you cave in, well, then you're not being responsible. So again, if you really have moved beyond the level of mere intelligence, you've come to real judgment and responsibility, you are ipso facto going to be divisive. Now, it doesn't mean the hateful kind of division. That's always bad. But this is a legitimate, inevitable type of divisiveness if you're really being intellectually responsible. Which is why very often in the commentary, when the term is thrown around, oh, what a divisive person. Oh, you're being so divisive. Well, yeah, if by that you mean I've made a real judgment, I've taken a real position, and I'm sticking with it responsibly. Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of. That's an inevitable consequence of being intellectually responsible. So, could we drop, please, culture warrior and divisive? I think they get us nowhere. They get us stuck at the level of basically name calling. What's always the desideratum is the return to argument. The return to argument. Make your case. Make your judgment. Try to convince your opponent. But getting stuck at this level of essentially name calling, it's a waste of time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel.